The island of Hven rises abruptly out of the strait between Denmark and Sweden that separates the North and Baltic Seas. Unlike several of its neighboring outposts, it does not emerge gently from the cold, glacier-fed waters, but rather juts upward with yellow cliffs made of chalk and sand that ward off invaders and visitors alike. It is a small place, only a few miles in area, and once above the cliffs, it rises gently to an elevation of a few hundred feet above the ocean at the center of the island. From one side, the city of Helsingborg can be seen, while from the other, Copenhagen. It is a pastoral place now, as it has been for most of its history. Occupied by a few hundred souls, it is given mostly over to farming, herding, and fishing, and it is inhabited by those who live in the small village of Tuna, near its northern shore. It wasn't always this way, though. In the 9th century, the island, well suited as a citadel across the sea lanes that connected the Baltic to the east with the North Sea to the west, had been a place ruled by a family who built keeps, the ruins of which are still there. One of the keeps, Nordberg Castle by name, had been the site of a tale that rivals anything Shakespeare or the Greek playwrights ever penned. The story went that once a woman named Lady Grimmel had invited her 2 brothers to the fortress. The 3 siblings had ruled the island together, but the sister was no longer content to share power. During the feasting that took place when they gathered, she had her brothers murdered and claimed the sole right to rule. Unknown to Lady Grimmel, though, was that one of her handmaidens, Vinild, was pregnant with her dead brother's child. Born Renke, the boy was the true heir to the throne of the island. As he grew, Lady Grimmel had ruled the 4 keeps, named Nordberg, Sonderberg, Karlsborg, and Hammer, and collected the wealth of the island. When he reached the age of manhood, fueled by Vinild's stories of Lady Grimmel's treachery, Ranke killed his aunt and took possession of the island and the keeps. In later days, the villagers of Tuna told of Lady Grimmel's treasure, buried in an alder fen, and guarded by a dragon seldom seen, but often heard on nights when the storms swept the sound of Elsinore. To claim the treasure, assuming the dragon could be overcome or avoided, one would need a pair of golden keys that had been lost to the sea. Later, in 1288, a marauder by the name of Eric the Priest-Hater and his men overwhelmed the fortress and whatever hands stood to defend them. After that, it was determined that the great keeps on either side of the strait were more practical and the fortifications on the island were abandoned, and thus it reverted to the ownership and cultivation of a small community that held the land free of feudal obligation to a lord or manor. They owed taxes only to the King of Denmark, or so they thought. In 1576, on a raw February day, a Danish noble disembarked from a ship along with a retinue and called a meeting of the heads of the households of the island, numbering about 50. When all were present, a bailiff stepped forward and read a proclamation from the king that would alter the lives of all who lived on the island. In it, they were told that the king had placed their island under the authority of the eldest son of the Brahe family, and that he would have the traditional rights of any Danish lord. The right to collect taxes, the right to require boon labor, and the right to direct the herders where to graze their swine and collect a fee for that privilege. He would have obligations as well, to keep the church staffed with a pastor and in good condition, to represent the inhabitants before the king and his court, and to see that all were treated fairly and with justice. The men looked at each other with disbelief, but the seals on the document were from Frederick himself, and the bailiff brooked no argument. Life on the island was going to change, but no one knew how much. The nobleman stepped forward and asked for boarding at one of the farms, and once it was obtained, set out to have his things unloaded from the boat that had transported him and his party to the island. Had any of the villagers followed him to the high point at the center of Hven, they would have realized that things were about to change a whole lot more than they could have possibly imagined. On that very night, the nobleman, Tycho Brahe, set up his astronomical instruments and made the first of what would be nearly 2 decades of observations, measuring the angle between the moon and the planet Mars as the two passed ever so slowly by each other in the evening sky. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 15.2, Supplemental, on Tychos Island. When Tycho was given the island of Hven as a perpetual fiefdom, along with other estates, for the establishment of a new research facility, it was the culmination of the path he had set out on 16 years earlier, when he had first joined the faculty at the University of Copenhagen to view a lunar eclipse and was enthralled by the sight and frustrated by the inaccuracy of the prediction of its occurrence. Each decision made to continue to study astronomy, to embark on multiple universities tours, to accept the canonry at Roskilde, to join his uncle Steen in Heravad, to publish his observations of a new star and then to give lectures at Copenhagen over it, had taken him further away from the traditional life of a Danish nobleman to something new. That life of an aristocratic researcher, freeing from the demands of state to pursue new learning and knowledge for the great glory of kingdom and crown. And even as he first set foot on the island where his vision would be turned into reality, Tycho also began planting the seeds of his own eventual downfall. For Tycho, the collection of all of the properties he had been granted and the people who worked them and paid taxes and rents on what they produced by the sweat of their labor formed a unit over which he was the head. It is clear that in his aristocratic role he saw himself as the paterfamilias of what he oversaw in a fairly Roman sense. While not legally the same as the institution that formed one of the pillars of Roman society and cultural life, in that Tycho didn't literally have the power of life and death over his subjects, he did see all of the elements under his oversight as resources to be used to bring about a singular vision, that of him running the premier scientific research facility in all of Europe. While Christensen points out that none of the elements upon which Brahe drew were necessarily new, the scope and scale, along with the integrated sense of what was to take place, certainly exceeded any previous efforts that had been put into motion to achieve the goals of science. While Tycho saw everything he was responsible for as being under his paterfamilias, it is clear that this was a layered sort of thing. While the family estates and church lands he inherited were certainly used to provide for the enterprise, they were clearly on the fringes, with less thought being given to them than the concerns closer to Brahe's heart. Next came the island that would host the observatory and its inhabitants. Tycho exerted a more direct influence over their lives through the demanding of the ancient practice of boon labor, wherein a tenant on a lord's land would be required to give 1 or 2 days a week of free labor towards the work of the estate. In this case, that meant helping to transport the materials that would be used to construct the observatory and then doing the manual labor necessary for the process of construction. For the farmers, herders, and fishers of the island who had never been burdened with this requirement, the law was thought to be onerous. In time, they would complain to the king himself, who would send investigators, who, after doing their due diligence, sided with Tycho in upholding his right to require the work, though they did establish clear boundaries and limits as to how far his request could go. Closest to Tycho, in terms of his oversight and direct intervention into the daily lives of people, were those who worked directly with the observatory and, of course, his own family. It is clear that Brahe thought of the observatory staff, the craftsmen, administrators, and assistants, as members of his extended family, and thus he did not hesitate to get involved in their lives at a depth we would find overbearing today. If he worked at Uraniborg, Tycho more or less acted as if he had all the legal rights a person's father might, including giving permission to travel, setting and settling contracts, and even overseeing personal relationships. In this, he was usually tremendously generous, acting in the spirit of amicitia that we discussed in the last episode. But he could become unreasonable and abusive when angered or frustrated, something that would become more commonplace as he grew older. With those who were not part of his very large family, but with whom he interacted on a more or less equal level, there were two sorts of relationships. The first was the bonds of aristocratic loyalty with the other ruling families of Denmark. Tycho had duties and responsibilities to both the royal family and the other members of his class. While his relationship with King Frederick and his wife was strong and appropriately respectful and deferential, his interactions with his peers were often less so. While some families, such as the Oxes, understood Tycho's desire to pursue scholarship, others were less inclined to be so understanding, and thus looked down on the eldest Brahe. In response, Tycho often saw them as being petty and stupid. In letters, he often complained about the shallowness of their conversation and their lack of true perspective. As time went on, he was less careful in his condemnation of their parochialism, something that would cost him dearly down the road. The second was his attitudes towards his intellectual peers, those who understood the humanist ideals of Philip Melanchthon and the growing influence of Neoplatonism. As we said, this was expressed in that idea of amicitia, first put forth in the writings of the Roman statesman Cicero. As an aside, I hope you find it as odd and strangely delightful as I do that the ideas of a Roman orator dead some 1600 years had such an influence on the intelligentsia of Europe at this time. It boggles my mind that the young men of the German Christian universities would so find the, quite frankly, strongly Epicurean ideas more appealing than the competing conception of personal relationships set forth in the Scripture those same universities were clearly established to support and promote. That idea was something called agape, or sacrificial servant-oriented love. Amicitia found its greatest expression in the giving of gifts and doing of favors, not for the least of society, but rather to those who could understand and reciprocate. Amicitia was the devotion of a group of colleagues, the mutual sharing of ideas that takes place in a fraternity of like-minded individuals devoted to the same things. It was the pleasure derived from the company of those who valued the same pursuits, treasured the same knowledge, and appreciated the same aesthetic in life. As I said, it was something I think Epicurus and his devotees would have been very much at home in. For Tycho and his friends, whether from the University of Copenhagen, or from Rostock, or from Augsburg, this shared pursuit, an almost worship of knowledge and learning, is symbolized by Apollo and the Muses, and in Tycho's case, specifically Urania, was what gave their lives its deepest meaning and greatest joy. It was fulfilled in the writing of prefaces to each other's academic works, the giving of instruments and artistic pieces, and dedications of contributions to the greater pool of knowledge. As Tycho had more and more success, beginning first with his observation of the new star in 1572, and then with the publication of his work on the Comet of 1577 and his attempts to measure Martian parallax, he ascended in these circles, becoming a prince among lords. For a time, he saw this not just as his own triumph, but also as a triumph for his king and all of Denmark. However, when Frederick died, there was something of an untethering of the two that would lead Tycho to see himself as something more than aristocracy in Denmark, a trait that would certainly create him an awful lot of enemies. However, these troubles were a decade in the future. In 1576 and 77, Tycho's star was clearly climbing to heights unimagined just 5 years earlier, when he returned from Augsburg to attend to his father with no titles and few prospects. He planned to create a legacy now that would last for centuries, and nature was rather obliging in providing the events that would help him do just that. As Tycho contemplated and began sketching out his plans for the observatory and laboratory that would sit at the center of the island, he once again drew on the Neoplatonic ideas of proportion and harmony first found in the writings of the Pythagoreans. In an early modern European version of feng shui, it was thought that all of creation, in this sort of set of ideas, operated according to the fundamental whole number ratios that govern the musical scale. No man had better captured this spirit than the Italian architect Andrea Palladio, whose 1570 publication of The Four Books of Architecture summarized the application of the principles we've just discussed to the designing and building of structures in a brilliant synthesis of ideas. Palladio reinterpreted classical Greek architectural styles for the times, and Tycho, in his turn, reinterpreted those, abandoning the opening, airy structures of Italian villas that would provide little protection against the Baltic winds, but keeping the ideals of symmetry and proportion both in the structure itself and in the grounds that surrounded it. Each dimension was built in one of the harmonic ratios found in music. The towers were 15 feet tall. The facade of the sides of the building was 30 feet long. The peak of the roof was 45 feet tall, and the side of the central square of the complex 60 feet in length. 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, all laid out in perfect proportion. Such ideas would extend inward to the proportions of the rooms and the alchemical laboratories that made up the working spaces of the structure to create what was thought to be a harmonious whole. As the construction began, Tycho's friends gathered to pay tribute to his vision and place the cornerstone, which they had made and engraved for this specific event, literally founding the whole enterprise on that virtue of amicatia. And though the event was saddened by the passing of one of Tycho's closest friends from the University of Copenhagen, he soon found a most portentous date for the cornerstone's laying, August 8th, determined by the positions of the planets in the heavenly realms. High officials of the Danish crown came to the ceremony, as did his colleagues from Copenhagen. While the island showed forth its late summer glory in the golden sun, the villagers who shouldered the burden of hosting the guests would have been less than uplifted by what seemed the vanity of the odd magi who had been foisted upon them. Tycho himself, though, would remain on the island as the year wound down. Not yet residing in the observatory, he would have been boarded with one of the villagers and then traveled to the observatory to make his observations as the weather allowed. The granting of the island, though, for scientific purposes, did not relieve Tycho of his courtly functions, and so in May of 1577 he traveled back to the court of the king to join in the 2 weeks of festivities surrounding the christening of the long-awaited heir to the throne, the infant Christian. At this ceremony, Tycho was given the great honor and responsibility of casting the horoscope for the boy, something of great importance that required him to know the positions of each of the planets with great accuracy. Over the course of the next 2 months, he would begin with the predictions found in the Alphonsan and Prutenic table, which he would then correct with his own meticulous observations. In the end, he had a 27-page document for the positive attitudes of the infant prince and another 44 pages for the challenges the boy would eventually face. The other event that would shape his life on Hven after Tycho had returned there was the Comet of 1577. Brahe had noticed it while fishing for his dinner early on the evening of November 13th. It was too bright to be a star, and it was not in the right place to be Saturn, the only evening pattern at the time. As the sky dimmed, Tycho watched as the star grew a long, fiery tail. The fish and dinner forgotten, Tycho rushed to begin to make observations. These would last throughout the winter of 1577 and 78, transfixing not only Tycho, but all of Europe, including the mother of a young boy in southern Germany, who took her son by the hand and led him to the top of a hill above the small town of Leonberg. Unfortunately, Johannes Kepler's eyesight was poor, either from genetics or a bout of smallpox, and so he could only dimly make out the apparition and soon fell asleep in her lap, an inauspicious start to the career of the man who would take Brahe's observations to places the older astronomer would never imagine. As with the star of 1572, Brahe established that the comet had to be a phenomenon that occurred beyond the sphere of the moon. Moreover, he and Kepler's eventual professor, Michael Maestlin, would independently establish that the path of the comet through the heavens would take it across a number of the spheres thought to constitute the structure that held everything up. This result, even more than the original observations of the new star, called into question the entire fundamental underpinning of both the Ptolemaic and Copernican models. How could there be crystalline spheres if there was a comet which would go crashing through them like an arrow through the proverbial china shop? While there were those who felt that this argued for a more fluid picture of Aristotle's luminiferous ether or quintessence, and others who attempted to cast doubt on the accuracy of Tycho's work, the results were more or less unassailable. Finally, Tycho used his observations to put forth the idea that the comet also had to be orbiting the sun. This was yet another strike against the Aristotelian picture of the heavens that required all things to travel in circles around the earth, or at least a point close to it. These three conclusions, drawn from Tycho's observation of the comet, called into question all of the models of the natural philosophers as far as Tycho was concerned. It would be this event that would set him on the path to coming up with the radical departure from what had gone before, his Tychonic model of the cosmos, with the Earth being stationary, the moon and sun orbiting it, but then the 5 other planets, and presumably all other sorts of things such as comets, orbiting the sun. One of the really striking things here about Tycho's work on the comet was how he published his research, and I'd like to take just a moment to talk about that. Due to a variety of delays in getting the work to press, including another mammoth horoscope for the second child of King Frederick, Tycho's observations were coming out after a number of the other astronomers had published their work, almost a year later in some cases. For Tycho to make a mark in such a crowded field, he had to do something above and beyond the standard set of positional observations and astrological prognostications to get noticed. Now, while his conclusions would certainly do that, the book had to be read in the first place. And so what he did is he included all of his data in the very first chapter, including some data that seemed at odds with itself. For example, his measurement of the position of the comet with respect to 12 bright stars gave a slightly different position than the measurement of the comet with respect to the moon. Tycho left this discrepancy in the book and only added a note towards the end of the publication process once he figured out the reason for that discrepancy. While certainly not the characterization of error that would arise in the 1850s, it is remarkable that Brahe was willing to allow others to see so far into the nuts and bolts of his data and to acknowledge the presence of observational error and uncertainty. So how did Tycho arrive at this point when so many others had not? Well, it was because of the other major initiative Tycho was undertaking by this point. It was something that he had started a long time ago. Begun in earnest in Haravad, he had spent a lot of time thinking about how to make instruments that were both more precise in their measurement and more accurate in their readings. In this endeavor, he has invented a new form of sighting scope that significantly reduced the error made by an observer trying to look first with one eye and then the other. Those who have used stock sights on a gun are likely familiar with this phenomenon, created by the parallax caused by the distance between the two eyes. Additionally, Brahe developed a forerunner to the modern Vernier scale used in many instruments, such as the Vernier Caliper, to more precisely measure between two marks on a scale. His stated goal was to be able to measure angles with an accuracy of 1 arcminute, or 1/60th of a degree. In my reading, it seems that there's a lot of debate as to whether he ever achieved this, though he claims to have in his writings. From what I've been able to find, and through consultation with Berry College's Dr. Timberlake, it seems that the best he was likely able to achieve would have been around 4 arcminutes. While still impressive, this will call into question a few of his later claims. In order to measure the motion of the comet with enough precision to determine whether there is any parallax when he observed the comet's position at points 5 hours apart, he had to be able to measure to a fraction of the 26 minutes of arc the comet would be able to have moved through the sky in that time. He was literally the only person in the world who had instruments and expertise at that point to make such precise and accurate observations. While there were certainly other astronomers and mathematicians who could turn data into conclusions, none of them could produce what he could. This would remain the case until the development and subsequent scientific use of the telescope some 75 years after this time. As Uraniborg began to take shape, he designed new instruments that included additional innovations that made them easier to use so that fewer assistants would be needed to gather data from a single instrument. This had two benefits. The first was that it freed up observers to either make the same observation with a different tool, thus increasing the confidence of the numbers being arrived at. The second was that it allowed for more observations to be taken, i.e. the distance of Mars to 10 different stars instead of 5, or the observations of both Mars and Saturn on the same night. These tools were used for basically two projects at this point. The first was the creation of the most accurate star chart ever produced. While he had resided in Augsburg, Tycho had commissioned the construction of a wooden globe that was to be as perfectly spherical as possible. Though it had been damaged in the intervening years, repairs were effected to bring it back to true, and it was sheathed in metal. As the positions of stars were established, they would be added to the globe, something that would sit at the center of Uraniborg for years. Tycho's goal was to measure 1,000 stars in order to match the ancient Ptolemaic and Hipparchic catalogs. This was not simply a location project, however. Built into the work was an attempt to measure stellar parallax for the stars in order to determine if Copernicus's model was in fact correct. This required multiple measures of a star's position with respect to several other stars at several times during the year, and over a period of several years to discount any possible effects of precession. In other words, this was really a massive project. The other project that he attempted in this first decade on Hven was the attempt to measure the parallax of Mars during the time that the planet was in opposition. In other words, while it traveled through the southern sky near midnight. As you might have noticed, this practice of measuring parallax was Tycho's signature move, as it were. While the idea had been around for a couple of millennia, no one had had the tools necessary to use it to determine things. And now he thought that he did. However, while parallax is a very powerful technique in astronomy to measure distances to things, and it's still being used by space probes like the Hipparchus or Gaia missions most recently, to actually measure this phenomena requires more precision than Tycho would have had. In fact, to measure the stellar parallax, or just the parallax shift for anything in the solar system further away than the moon, requires a telescope and an exceptionally stable mount. Tycho didn't know this though, and so he undertook both endeavors with an awful lot of vigor. He was never able to measure stellar parallax, of course, and combined with his mistaken measurements of the angular sizes of the stars, he concluded that Copernicus's model was most likely wrong. However, these early results were soon called into question by the Mars opposition measurements that he was making. Without getting too technical, depending on the model of the solar system one used, Mars should either have a smaller amount of parallax than the Sun does, i.e. the case in the Ptolemaic model, or a larger amount, which would have been the case in the Copernican model. Since one couldn't measure any parallax for the Sun, if one could measure parallax for Mars, that would settle the question. The best chance to do that would be in opposition when, at least in the Copernican model, Mars would be closest to the Earth, roughly 1/2 the distance of the Earth to the Sun if the ratios determined by the canon of Frombork were to be believed. The difficulty with this turned out to have to do with the effect of the Earth's atmosphere. It had been known since before the time of Ptolemy that the atmosphere had the ability to bend or refract light coming from the Sun. Unfortunately, no one was really sure by how much. To measure Mars' parallax, one had to observe Mars's position shortly after sunset and then again shortly before sunrise, the times when the effect of the atmosphere was going to be the largest. Tycho's first attempt to measure this shift in 1582 and 1583 assumed that the previous numbers calculated for refraction had been correct. The outcome from this, though, once all the calculations in spherical trigonometry were done, resulted in some really nonsensical results. After puzzling about it for a while, Tycho recognized that he needed to do a better job of characterizing what the atmosphere was doing with the calculations, specifically for his location. He used the 2-year period until the next opposition of Mars to come up with better estimates of atmospheric refraction, and when the phenomenon happened again, he was ready. Taking measurements in 1585, he found that Mars did, indeed, show a measurable parallax, thus disproving, at least in his mind, the Ptolemaic model once and for all. The problem was, how could he square the lack of stellar parallax with the presence of it in Mars? It was as if the Copernican model was correct in saying that Mars went around the Sun, while the Earth was also stationary, as was the case in the Ptolemaic model. Now Tycho, after conversations with another astronomer by the name of Paul Wittich, had begun entertaining a new idea. By 1548, as he prepared to measure Mars's motion again, even before he'd actually found the parallax, it seems clear that he hit upon the model that now bears his name. His recognition that the motion of the comet of 1577 had done away with the reality of the crystalline spheres allowed him to have planetary orbits that could now cross each other. While the model that he put forward completely did away with the structure of the heavens, it would explain the data in a way that was consistent with the measurements that had been taken so far, and he could show that it produced the exact same planetary configurations as Copernicus's model had. The observations of 1585, along with the lack of detection of stellar parallax, seemed to clearly show that his new model was the best option available. As I think about it, it's really a breathtaking intellectual accomplishment, a huge lateral step away from the prevailing models to something dramatically new in many ways. And while it would ultimately be shown to be wrong, it would open up possibilities Kepler would seize upon in his work. Not only would the idea of doing away with the unwieldy spheres be vital to the younger man's efforts, the mountains of data accumulated over 2 full tropical periods, or, as we think of them today, more than 2 full orbits of Mars, would prove essential to Kepler coming to the correct conclusions about the motions of the planets. To backtrack just a bit, let's get caught up on the construction of Uraniborg itself. One of the things that benefited Tycho in his creation of the Research Institute was that King Frederick was making extensive renovations to the royal castle, Kronborg, in Elsinore, just across the Sound from Hven. As such, Tycho and the king shared craftsmen, material, and ideas. To be his site architect, the person charged with turning the astronomer's ideas on paper into reality in wood, brick, and stone, Tycho chose a Dutch master mason by the name of Hans van Steenwinkel, who had been working at Kronborg. Steenwinkel was unfamiliar with the ideas of Palladio at first, but was actually a pretty quick study. Soon he had mastered the architectural premises of the Italian Renaissance and Neoplatonism and was drawing detailed plans for the structure. So good was Steenwinkel that within a year, Tycho turned over to him the entire oversight of the construction project. By July of 1579, the structure was deemed to be livable, and Tycho brought Kirsten and his children to the island to join him and the assistants that had begun to gather around him. The entire project would be completed in the autumn of 1581. The grounds consisted of the observatory itself, surrounded by earthen works that enclosed gardens both botanical and for food, fish ponds, and a fruit orchard containing over 300 trees of various species and varieties. All of this was surrounded by a low wooden fence and 2 gatehouses with kennels to keep uninvited locals out. There were also separate quarters for the servants and assistants, as well as for the printing press. In time, there would also be a paper mill that would be added to the grounds. All in all, It sounds very much like a Danish version of a large French or English manor home, but with the core function being that of scientific research. We'll include woodcut printings of the house and its floor plan on the podcast website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, if you'd like to get a better look at what the physical realization of Tycho's vision would have looked like. Excellent descriptions of it can be found in both the Christensen and Ferguson books we've referenced in the previous episodes. At the metaphorical center of the house, if it could be called that, was the community living and dining space. It would be here that Brahe would feed his family and staff at the long tables, and when meals were not taking place, the researchers could gather to study, work, and converse. The meals would have been long affairs, as was the custom in Denmark, often filled with scholarly conversation, such as what Tycho would have heard growing up in his aunt and uncle's home. Entertainers would have been retained on a fairly regular basis to relieve the monotony of the long Baltic winters, and so one can imagine something of a carnival atmosphere, with the language of astronomy and alchemy taking the place of the shouts of the Midway barkers. Over the years would come a procession of the rich and famous, the intellectual and scholarly, the curious and competent. Tycho was a diligent record keeper of all those who visited the island, and the ledger reads like a who's who's list from Northern Europe. From nobles and their families, to the scholars of the day, and even traveling clergy, many were those who Tycho entertained and toured through the house and its grounds. They were wined and dined, entertained and amused, and given the space to think and write, and on occasion join in the work being done there, if they were qualified. As you might imagine, as with so many of the opulent structures and facilities throughout history, this one was built and maintained on the backs of those who were not as well off. The villagers of Hven did not see the house as an architectural and scientific marvel, but rather as the castle of the golden-nosed magi who stole their labor and food, all the while peering into the unfathomable heavens and belching forth foul odors from his basement dungeons. In 1580 they complained again to the crown, a petition to which Tycho again responded. Once again a commission was sent, and the result was a further clarification of what Tycho could and could not ask his tenants to do and provide. As before, the villagers came out worse than the deal, mirroring a process taking place around Denmark and even throughout Northern Europe, as the aristocracy fought to assert themselves over the people they ruled and reestablish some semblance of the old feudal order in a new, more centralized governing apparatus. By 1583, Uraniborg was too crowded. Tycho's success, as well as his drive to build better instruments, led him to decide to construct a second observing facility he named Uraniborg. This was the second observatory that consisted of excavated pits in which the instruments could sit unbuffeted by the wind. Built a distance from the grounds of Uraniborg so as not to disturb the proportions of the original structure, it was able to both house larger, more precise instruments, but also separate the observers there from the observers in the house, so that any observations would be independent of each other. The first measurements from the structure were taken in 1585 as part of the Mars Parallax project. This is the pinnacle of Tycho's astronomical life. Nearly a decade into his time on Hven, he had the data to support his new model of the solar system over all of the others. Unfortunately, there had been a complication, a fly in the ointment that would begin the long, slow slide from the top of the mountain. That, however, will have to wait until next time, when we examine the decline and fall of Tycho Brahe. As we close this week's installment of our journey, let me take a moment to welcome all the new crew members who have liked our Facebook page over the last week. If you haven't already done so, may I encourage you to go back to the beginning of our third season here in order to follow our journey up to this point. In the first several episodes, I take some time to explain the motions of the night sky that we are referencing in these later shows. Also, If you are interested in the astronomy of several ancient cultures, we have a number of supplemental episodes devoted to that as well. Also, thanks to the couple of listeners who left reviews on iTunes. I really appreciate the feedback, and we will eventually get to talking about the astronomical practices of medieval China and the use of fireworks as the part of that. If you'd like to leave us a review on whatever service you use to share in the voyage, we'd be very grateful here at Scientific Odyssey World Headquarters. It helps us get the word out to others who might find what we're doing here worth taking a listen to. Finally, for those who are keeping count, you know that this is our 94th episode, not counting the brief show following my crash. That means in about a month or so, we'll hit that great milestone of all podcasts, the mythical 100th show. I'd like to find a way to celebrate the voyage, and so I thought this would be a good time to do a Q&A episode. So send me your questions. You can ask on our Facebook page. Just search on the podcast name to find it. You can shoot me a note on Twitter. At Chad Davies, all one word, is my handle there. You can post a comment on the website, or you can send me a note at cldavies@mac.com. Questions can be about anything, though if you've got a complicated science thing you want to know about, send your question in early so that I can do a bit of research. I'd really like to have a lot of fun with this, so let your imagination run wild, and we'll try to produce something truly epic. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, full sails on your journey.